name is Zardaryan. A little bit about myself. I was a hospital corpsman in the United States Navy for 14 years. My specialty was in the medical laboratory. So epidemiology for me is near and dear. We worked alongside with the public health officers. Anytime we had any adverse laboratory findings, we would have to report it to them. Now the specific critique that I worked on, the journal that I worked on was from the American Journal of Epidemiology, and the title of the journal was Childhood Social Disadvantage, Cardiometabolic Risk, and Chronic Disease in Adulthood. So the basic principle or the purpose behind this is that the study will show that the poor childhood socioeconomic class will have adverse reactions or adverse health issues in the future. The study began over 50 years ago in 1959 to 1966. So initially what they did was the researchers would ask the parents of the children, and the children being from ages from birth until 7 years old, and they would ask them specific questions so that they can place them in a socioeconomic status category. And the specific questions that they asked were living away from the home greater than 3 months, sibling deaths, moving more than 3 times, divorce, married, separated, or widowed parents, manual labor or for the main income earner, unemployed greater than 6 months. This one was specific for the father. The household income was less than or equal to the poverty threshold, and the highest education level is less than high school level. So basically the way it worked was that each one of those questions are worth 1 point. And the more yes answers that the mothers gave, the more disadvantaged the children were. So they were at a more disadvantaged socioeconomic status. From here on, we'll call it SES. And then in the future, what they did was they took the same participants, and on top of the questions, they also did laboratory tests and also blood pressure studies. Now, the purpose of the laboratory tests and the blood pressure studies was so that they could determine the cardiometabolic risk score. And the specific tests that they did for the laboratory were C-reactive protein, triglycerides, low-density lipoprotein, high-density lipoprotein, hemoglobin A1C, waist circumference, and also blood pressure. So just like the initial questions they asked 40 years prior, each one of the questions are worth 1 point. And the more yes answers that they had, the worse their cardiometabolic risk factor was. So the hypothesis for the research was that the children in the most disadvantaged group would have a more significant health concern than those that are in the least disadvantaged group. So the study specifically was a longitudinal study. It was over 40 years, and they followed initially 618 members. But in their adult years, what happened was that they weren't able to show the proof of their documents of their health issues. So a lot of them were actually disqualified from the research, and it ended up with 566 participants instead. Overall, the children who were most disadvantaged in the beginning ended up having the most health risks in their adult years. So the most disadvantaged children had 1.63 times more increase in their CMR than the ones that were in the lowest disadvantage category. So the outcome supported the hypothesis. So as I mentioned earlier, the specific techniques that they used initially were the questionnaires that were asked to the parents or the mothers specifically to be able to put them in the socioeconomic status category. And then eventually the adult years, they asked questions again, but now they had the laboratory, specific laboratory tests, and also the blood pressure studies. So the reason why I chose this topic to critique for this research is because my family would have been in the low socioeconomic status when we first immigrated to the United States when I was 7 years old. And I thought, it would be interesting to see how I would fare compared to the results that were found in the study. And sure enough, some of the laboratory findings were in the danger zone for me. My low-density lipoprotein was elevated. My high-density lipoprotein, the HDL, the good cholesterol, was low. And my triglycerides were also elevated. but everything else is within normal limits. But also I have to take into consideration that the study group was in their 40s when they did this. I'm in my early 30s, so who knows what will happen in the future. So hopefully I'll take better care of myself and not fall into that trap. I want to talk a little bit about the strengths of the research. So the research was able to follow 566 participants from pretty much birth until their middle adulthood. And basically they were able to support their hypothesis, and it took 40 years. They had a clear way of sorting the research participants regarding the socioeconomic status. It was easy to understand. The language was easy to follow. Some of the statistics was a little difficult, but it was still easy to follow. The limitations, on the other hand, was a little off. For example, they never mentioned anything about risks like family history. For example, both my grandparents, from my mom's side and my dad's side, have heart problems or had heart problems. They both passed away. So I know that I'm at a higher risk of having heart issues in the future. That wasn't addressed. Another thing that wasn't addressed was racial aspect, depending on the race of the people. For example, African Americans, they're at a higher risk of having high blood pressure. And there was plenty of African Americans in the study. Another aspect was the culture. They didn't take into consideration cultural aspect like food, religion, and so on. So overall, the limitations were pretty obvious for me. Even when I was looking at the research from the initially, it was easy for me to notice that these things were not there. So what are the public health implications for this research? According to a CIA statistical analysis, out of the 321 million people in the United States, 15% of them are below the poverty threshold. So that's roughly about 50 million people. What does that mean according to this research? That 50 million people are going to be in the most disadvantaged category. And on top of the other questions that were specifically asked that could still increase this number, which means that over 50 million people could potentially be at a high risk of health concerns in the future. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you all have a wonderful day.